Azure Static Web Apps lets you integrate your existing APIs with the /API endpoint. But if your backend is network isolated, then Azure Static Web Apps distributed hosts can't access it. So how can we work around this to integrate your virtual network bound resources to your Azure Static Web Apps? Let's start by talking about why backend integration is so important. When an API call is made to Static Web Apps /API endpoint, Static Web Apps proxies these calls to your backend. And when it does so, it also injects the auth headers needed for Static Web Apps built-in authentication. So this gives you two main benefits. First, you no longer have to configure cores because both your API and your Static Web Apps are hosted on the same domain. And second, you get to benefit from Static Web Apps built-in authentication because of the injection of the auth headers. So let's consider different alternatives for integrating your network isolated backend with your Static Web Apps resource. The first option is to make direct API calls from your website to your virtual network bound API. By doing so, a user's browser will make requests to Static Web Apps for static assets, such as HTML, JS, CSS, and then it'll make direct API calls to, in this case, an application gateway, which provides public access to your API. But with this method, you get neither benefit. You'll have to configure cores on your server since your Static Web App and your API are served from different domains. And your API calls aren't going through Static Web Apps hosts, so they won't get injected with the necessary auth headers. So the second option is to serve your Static Web Apps website from your virtual network and route calls to the /API endpoint to your backend resource and all other calls to your Static Web Apps. With this method, you recover one benefit. Your Static Web Apps resource and your API are hosted on the same domain, which means you don't have to configure cores. However, since API calls aren't going through Static Web Apps runtime, they aren't injected with auth headers. So this option doesn't provide the same benefits as Static Web Apps backend integration feature. So the third option is to use an API management instance as a gateway to your network isolated resources. With this method, your API management instance is integrated into your virtual network using the external mode. And this gives external access to your private resource. So this allows Azure Static Web Apps to proxy API calls to your API management instance, which proxies these calls to your backend resource. With this method, you can go in the portal and select your API management instance as a backend for your Static Web Apps, and this will lock down traffic to your API management to your Static Web Apps. Now with this method, you get both benefits. Your API is served from the /API endpoint, meaning that there's no additional cores configuration, and your API calls get proxied by Static Web Apps, which injects the auth headers necessary for Static Web Apps authentication feature. So to sum it all up, only the API management network integration option achieves both the integrated security and the seamless routing benefits of the backend integration feature. So it's the best option if you're trying to integrate your Static Web Apps with your network isolated backends. So I went ahead and built a quick demo demonstrating how you can use API management's virtual network integration feature in order to enable your Static Web Apps to access your network isolated backends. What I did is I created a virtual network and integrated an API management instance with the external mode. And then I created a function app with a private endpoint to simulate a network isolated backend. Let me show you the current state, and then I'll show you the extra steps that I take in order to link the Static Web Apps to the API management instance. First, let's start with the API management. As we can see here in the network tab, it's been integrated to the virtual network through the external mode. And I integrated the function app into the virtual network with the private endpoint, the same virtual network. And as we can see, when we tried to access the function app directly through the public internet, we are getting 403 forbidden. So the access restriction is doing its job. Now, what we'll do is we'll go into the API management instance and add the function app as an API. Now remember, the function app should be accessible by our API management instance because they're both integrated into the same virtual network. We'll go ahead and select the Azure function. Here, what we need to do is change the API URL suffix to API as is convention in Azure Static Web Apps backend integration feature. And then we'll click Create. And at this point, we can go ahead and test it. We'll make a simple GET request and let's send it off. And we are getting a 200, confirming that we do have access to our function app from our API management instance. Now, the last step is to go into our static web app resource in the APIs page and then link the API management as a backend. And once that's done, we'll go back to our API management instance and add the function app API to this product. Excellent. Everything should be ready. Now let's go to our static web app. We'll go ahead and refresh the page and we'll make a simple fetch request to the /API/HTTP trigger endpoint. Now what this will do is it will make a fetch request to the static web apps resource, which will then proxy it to the API management instance, which will then proxy it to the network isolated backend. Let's send it off. And as we can see, we are getting a 200. Now here, if we look at the body of the response, we can see that we have the XMS client principal, and that's simply because in the function app code, I went ahead and extracted the XMS principal from the request headers and just simply returned it. So we can confirm that we do have access to the XMS client principal and the user credentials in the network isolated backend. So in sum, we have our integration of our network isolated backend with our static web apps through the API management and VNet external integration. So thanks for watching. I hope you found the content valuable. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments. And on that note, until next video.